Hey, everybody. I want to welcome you to our class on grief and the holidays. We're going to be talking about some of the basics of grief, and especially as we enter into the holiday season, when our grief can sometimes seem to be a little stronger, as different things bring about memories of the people that are no longer here with us. How do we deal with those? And what are some healthy ways that we can go through the holidays where we can still find enjoyment of being with friends and family, but also looking for ways to honor and remember those that are not with us and be mindful and respectful of our grief, both our own and the grief of those around us. So, as we begin, I do want to make some big acknowledgements for the material that we're going to look at in this class. I want to acknowledge Larry Barber, who is the former director at GriefWorks and ChristianWorks Counseling in Dallas. He blogs at griefminister.com. Many of these thoughts and some of the lists that we're going to go through come from Larry, and also from Dr. Alan Wolfelt, director and founder of the Center for Life and Loss and Life Transition in Colorado. You can visit his website at centerforloss.com. Dr. Wolfelt has been a pioneer in the area of grief and trauma support, especially the companioning model of grief support that we're going to look at in this class. So really appreciate these men and their work, and they've been a big influence on me and on this material as well. Kind of a map of what we want to do in this class. Again, we want to talk a few basics about grief, called Grief 101, looking at things that affect how we grieve and why we might be grieving the way that we are, but also some principles and some myths about grief as well. And then we're going to move into self-care during the holidays, looking both at guidance for adults and guidance for the children and teens that are in our lives and in our families who may be grieving as well. And then looking at how to companion someone who is in grief. Maybe it's a friend or a family member. We're going to have some guidance for people in those roles as well. In our lesson this last Sunday night at Waterview, which you can view on our Waterview Facebook page or at waterview.org, we talked about grief being a gift from God, and especially this idea that God is a God of permission, and he gives us permission to grieve, and especially looking at John 11 and the story of Lazarus, that God in Jesus Christ, and even now through his Spirit, God grieves with us. And so what are some of the practical implications of that as we look at this? So that's kind of going to guide some of our thoughts in this class. No one needs to tell us that grief is complicated. Some words that others have used to describe their grief journey, and maybe you will find some overlap here. They've talked about the loss of routine. They've talked about that feeling of being alone, feeling isolated, especially after the first few weeks when all the calls and visits seem to begin to taper off. They've talked about having a bitterness as they think about their loss and the unfairness of it. Grief comes with a large amount of anger. And anger is simply not being happy with the way things are at the moment. We are not happy with the loss. We are not happy with the way that our life has changed now that this loss has occurred. We have bitterness coming from feelings of being helpless and feeling powerless to change the circumstances in which we find ourselves. It comes from that inward idea of perceived injustice, that what has happened to us is not fair. And it can even be anger toward the person who died for leaving us with the hole that's there and the responsibilities that now need to be taken care of, and the feelings that overwhelm us. We might look at the person that's not here anymore and feel even some resentment or some anger toward them. And that's normal. Other words to describe grief are misunderstood. It can be hard to put into words how we're feeling. The words of being drained, exhaustion is a constant experience for those of us in grief, both mentally and physically and emotionally, because we are feeling a lot of different things, and we are having to sift through those and evaluate them and trying to do everyday things while being emotionally weighed down. And then there's the word cyclical. One of the things that we may have heard about grief that turns out really not to be the case is this mistaken idea that grief is linear. Most of us like things in our lives that follow a certain order, and when we've done step A, we go on to B and C, and we don't go backwards. But grief doesn't really work that way. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is famous for developing the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now, certainly we will feel all of those, but we can certainly cycle back through them as well in any order, sometimes multiple times a day. And so, one thing to remember is that we may get the mistaken idea that if we are experiencing a stage or an emotion that is before the stage that we're currently at, we might make the mistake of thinking that we're moving backward, that we're not making any progress. And that is certainly not the case. That can go along with those competing emotions as well. We talked about feeling misunderstood earlier. Uh, Competing emotions like anger and sadness, where I want to be alone and I want to be with others all at the same time. I am upset that no one seems to be acknowledging my loss, and then I am upset that people are acknowledging the loss. I want to close this section talking about grief in general with a quote from a good friend of mine. Her name is Melissa Duncan. She attends the Eastridge Church of Christ in Rockwall, and she and her husband Josh lost their 2-year-old son Eli in a car wreck. And they direct actually the Grief Share program at Eastridge now. And Melissa says it like this. She says, grief is a pain that goes beyond muscles and bones, a soul deep pain. The most painful thing I can imagine having to experience. I felt like I was going crazy for a while. Grief has a very real physical toll on us, and it can touch areas emotionally and spiritually that we have never felt touched before. Our grief can penetrate that far down into us and make us feel those things and activate areas of thinking and believing and feeling that maybe have never been done so before. Another thing about grief is the way that we react to our grief and the way that we handle it is one of the most transformative experiences of our lives. Grief affects every single aspect of who we are. Grief affects us physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. And grief refuses to be compartmentalized. It won't simply stay in one area of our life and leave the other areas alone. And so grief is a huge factor, especially in our younger years, at forming how we will behave later in life, depending on how we have processed and dealt with traumatic grief experiences in our own lives. How we handle them and how we process them can have an effect on us years later about how we live and how we act and the things that we do, both positively and negatively. And so in that sense, we might sort of imagine that loss is a rock thrown into the lake of our lives, and grief is the ripples that continue to extend out indefinitely. And not only does grief affect every part of our life holistically, the way we grieve is affected by numerous factors. Our grief is affected by our past experiences. Again, we mentioned that grief and having a loss in our childhood can be very transformative for us later in life. Our past experiences on grief can also develop unspoken rules about how we handle grief and trauma within our family. Our religious beliefs, and of course, there is so much that we could say here about this. The way that we view God or God's existence is hugely important in the way that we handle our grief. And so, because of that, grief ministry really begins long before there is a loss in someone's life. Grief ministry begins with the kind of God that we have grown up believing or not believing in. It begins with the kind of God as church leaders that we are proclaiming and teaching in our churches. I think about my kids and the game they used to play in the car to get back at the other one. They used to call out something really cool out the window, and the minute that the other child would turn to look and say, "Where is it?" the other child would say, "Oh, we already passed it." They used to really frustrate the other person. Same as with grief ministry. If we are looking to um, characterize God the way He is in Scripture as compassionate and patient and a God of permission and grieving with us, if we wait to do that until the loss has occurred, we've already passed really the opportune time in which we can do that. It really begins long before that, laying a healthy foundation of theology and who God is and the way that He is evident in our lives and the way that He interacts with us and the way that He feels toward us, the way that He feels toward the brokenness in this world. All of those things are important for developing the right biblical caricature of God, so that then when that grief and that loss does enter our life, we have something healthy to fall back on as we deal with that grief, and the God who walks with us. He will react in our minds and in our hearts however we have been predisposed to think of Him doing so. So our religious beliefs obviously play a huge role in the way that we grieve. Our physical health at the time of our loss is important. Grief takes a physical toll. It can make existing issues worse. Grief can suppress our immune system. It can make us vulnerable to illness of all kinds. And even a simple lack of sleep, which is a common symptom of grief, can lead to multiple issues. Again, as our bodies become weaker and as our immune systems begin to take a toll on them. Our socioeconomic situation. There are all kinds of resources that we may or may not have access to depending on our socioeconomic situation. And if our family or if we as individuals are already struggling financially, grief simply adds a new layer of stress to that. The kind of loss that we experience and the kinds of losses we may have already experienced plays a big role as well. There is a great difference between a sudden loss and an expected loss and the way that we handle that. We still grieve, but we will grieve very differently most of the time. There is also a difference between a traumatic loss, such as suicide or a car wreck, versus more of a health-related death, such as a heart attack or cancer. And those things can affect the way we grieve. Our relationship to the person who has died. The loss of a child is very different from the loss of a spouse, which is different from the loss of a parent or a grandparent or the loss of a friend. And all of those are different from each other, and we will handle those differently, including what are the shared experiences that we have with that person, and are they positive or negative that we have going into that time of loss. The level of support available to us, our friends, family, our church community. Grief requires ideally a community that can walk through that time with us, and it requires a stable community. And of course, that's one of the things that we at Waterview are trying to do even better, is create a strong community of support to walk through those times of grief. And so with all of these factors coming to bear on the way that we grieve, we find a difficult element at work in our grief, and that is this: that grief is at once a unifying experience, but it is also an isolating experience. It's unifying because all of us will go through grief and loss. It means an opportunity for evangelism, certainly in the right time and place as we minister to those who are going through loss. It's a time to talk about God and the God who cares for us and who is walking with us. It's a time to share our faith and proclaim what the Christian story has to say to loss and grief. It's one of the most shared experiences of being human. The human experience will always involve grief, and yet no one's grief will look like anyone else's. Everyone's grief will be unique to them for all of the reasons that we just discussed. And so grief is both unifying and isolating at the same time. Let's talk about a few myths about grief as well. One of the first myths that we have is that giving into grief and its emotions shows a lack of faith or spiritual strength. And And again, I think about John 11, which we looked at Sunday night in our lesson, where Jesus comes and he grieves and weeps with Mary and Martha. Um, all people, regardless of their level of spiritual maturity or the depth of their faith, are going to experience grief at the loss of someone that they love. And their beliefs can be a comfort, and they should be a comfort. The things that we believe about Jesus and the things that the Bible says about God and loss should be a support and provide comfort and strength, but they do not eliminate grief. They do not eliminate the pain of losing someone. So again, the strongest person among us can have great emotional responses to grief, and that's not a reflection upon a low faith or a lack of faith. Um, our grief, the level of our grief, and the level of our faith and our spiritual maturity are not always directly correlated. Myth number 2: giving into grief and its emotions is being self-centered and selfish. This is especially common myth for those who are people pleasers, who don't want to burden anybody, who don't want to make a scene. Grief is not selfish. Grief is self-care. Grief is a gift that God builds into us in order to allow us to cope with the significant losses in our life. Um, Loss creates a wound, and grief is our way of dealing with that wound, of calling attention to it, just like a sore tooth. And grief helps us to deal with that in a healthy way. And so to ignore that grief, to circumvent it, or to set it aside or rush our way through it, is the same as not giving proper attention to the wound that we have, which can cause further complications down the road. Myth number 3: individuals must grieve in appropriate ways and places. And for any of us who have gone through grief, we know that one of the things that we may experience is that the emotions that we have with it are often uncontrollable. They often occur at very inconvenient times and places, and we simply have to deal with them. And that is simply the way that grief goes. Uh, Dealing with your grief appropriately simply means grieving and letting those feelings and emotions be real, and sitting with them and moving through them and not stifling them. Myth number 4: grief is only an emotional reaction. The truth is that grief, as we've talked about, is a reaction and a process involving the entire person. Grief is much more than an emotion. It is a state of being. It has physical, emotional, spiritual, social aspects. And deep grieving will not only occur in all those aspects of who we are, but it will occur there because those are the aspects of our life and our person that need healing. And again, we said that grief is a healing of wounds. And so we have wounds physically, emotionally, mentally, socially. And so grief in all those areas will bring the healing that we need. And let's make no mistake, because grief is so far reaching, it's exhausting. It's exhausting work that demands the full resources of what I bring to it. That I need to be uh, focused on my grief in such a way that I can give the proper attention that it deserves. Myth number 5: grievers must let go or eventually detach from their lost loved one. The truth is, you can't do that. And to try to do that will only make your grief worse. It will only stifle it in order and have it come back later on much bigger. What grief is really about is learning to accept the reality of that person's death, of their loss, the impact it's having on you, and the way that it's changed you. Grief is about coming to grips with that new reality. But the great thing, and the way that God created grief, is we don't have to forget that person. We don't have to stop remembering them. We don't have to let go. We will always love and remember that person. We will just do so in a different way because they are no longer with us. In fact, as Larry Barber is fond of saying, grief is simply loving someone after they're gone. We don't have to let go. We don't have to remember them. And that's a good thing. Finally, myth number 6, people only grieve losses caused by death. Again, we talked about this a little bit in our lesson Sunday night, but all losses are grieved. All change in life has some level of grief attached to it, because grief is a response to change. It is especially a response to the loss of the familiar, to the loss of routine. Moving, divorce, job loss, traumatic events, all of those things have an element of a grief response that goes with them. And so we need to be mindful of that and realize that we will experience grief in all those different ways, and be prepared for that. And again, that's a good thing. That's part of our response to those changes. Before we move into our discussion of grief and the holidays, let's finish out this opening section on grief with 5 basic principles for grief. The first of those is that grief is the natural response to loss. We talked about God giving us the ability to grieve as a gift. And again, as Larry Barber says, grief is loving someone after they're gone. Christianity does not shy away from grief or loss. The Bible is full of suffering. The Bible is full of people who are going through difficult times in their life and holding on to their faith in God. It speaks to it plainly and clearly and strongly. And in fact, the Christian story centers around an experience of loss and grief on the cosmic scale with Jesus on the cross. And so grief, if it is anything else, grief is a natural response. And anything that is natural means that God is behind it. Grief is something that God gives us as a way to respond in a healthy way to loss. Principle number 2, emotions experienced during grief are neither good nor bad. They simply are. Again, grief is not linear. There is not some order of emotions to go through. Trying to change our emotions in grief is a futile effort that will only make us feel more grief or even more anger. But if we view our grief as a gift from God, if we view it as a healing mechanism that God has given us, we will realize that God does not condemn the emotions that we feel. What we do with them and the way that we react to those emotions is up to us. Certainly, we are called to react to them in a righteous and holy and morally upright way. And our emotions in grief are not licensed to sin, but neither are they wrong simply because we are feeling them. And so the anger or the bitterness or the sadness or whatever it might be, those emotions are simply are, and it's up to us to decide how we process them and what we do with them. And this is part of giving permission to our grief and giving permission to others in their grief as well. Principle number 3, grief emotions will be dealt with. They will be dealt with now or later. It's really up to us. The emotions that we have at the time of loss do not stay buried. If we suppress them or repress them or go around them, they will resurface. They will demand to be acknowledged, demand to be heard. But many times, if that's the case, they will return to us later in life stronger than before, and perhaps even out of our ability to control them or to understand really what's going on. What we need to be able to do, and what our communities need to enable us to do and help us do, is to face the emotions of grief at the outset bravely and openly, rather than burying them. This is how we need to walk through our grief rather than going around it. Principle number 5. Let's see. Give me just one second. I apologize. Principle number 4, which is not on my PowerPoint here, grief is an individualized experience. Not everyone grieves in the same way. All the different factors that we've looked at in our own life and in our relationship with the person that has died, all of those things will affect our grief. And so it is not up to us to decide necessarily if someone around us is grieving in an appropriate way or not. As it's been said, We are doing well with our grief when we are grieving. And finally, principle number 5, grief will not always be like it is in the beginning. As time passes, the grief experience changes. Not always better. Grief doesn't really get better. It simply gets different. We might say it gets easier simply in the sense that we learn to deal with it in a more regular, healthy way. We don't ever get over a loss. We don't ever get past a loss, and we shouldn't seek that precisely because we will never stop loving the person that has died. There really is no return to normal. There is simply a new normal that we must learn to deal with after a loss. Grief will always be with us, but it will not always be the overwhelming, emotionally charged grief that we have at the beginning. Uh, the level of um, the level of effect that it has on us will change in time, and we will learn to cope with it on a daily basis. That concludes the end of the first part of our class, focused on just the basics of grief. The next section of our class will focus on now how do we deal with that grief in healthy ways during the holidays.